Every hospital has its secrets. Long hallways where the lights flicker just a little too often, rooms where nurses refuse to go alone, and whispers in the dark from mouths that should be silent. Tonight, you'll hear 5 terrifying tales from those who have witnessed the unexplainable, hospital chaplains who were called to comfort the living, but sometimes encountered something else. In my years as a hospital chaplain, I've come to accept that death isn't always quiet. Sometimes it lingers. Hospitals are strange places at night. The fluorescent lights hum softly, the steady beep of monitors fills the air, and somewhere down the hall a cart squeaks as a nurse makes their rounds. But in between those familiar sounds, in the spaces where the living hesitate to look, there are moments that don't belong to this world. A few months ago, I was called to comfort a dying patient, an elderly man named Mr. Holloway. He had been in the hospital for weeks, slipping in and out of lucidity, and it had been a long time since anyone had come to visit him. His family, if he had any, had long since stopped calling. I had sat beside him in the dim light of his hospital room, my Bible resting open in my lap as I spoke softly, offering a final prayer. He never responded, never gave any sign that he could hear me, but I had the strange sensation that he was listening. That night, as I gathered my things to leave, I felt a quiet sense of peace. It wasn't unusual for patients to die alone, but at least Mr. Holloway had not been completely abandoned in his last moments. I passed by his room one last time before heading out. The door was slightly ajar, and as I glanced through the gap, I felt my breath hitch in my throat. Mr. Holloway was sitting up. His back was rigid, his frail shoulders squared in a way that seemed unnatural for someone who had been lying weakly in bed just hours before. His hands rested stiffly on the sheets, and his face was eerily blank. His skin, pale and slack in death, seemed almost waxen in the dim glow of the bedside monitor. I hesitated, my pulse thudding loudly in my ears. "Mr. Holloway?" My voice was barely above a whisper. No response. His eyes were open, staring, not at me, but at the corner of the ceiling. His expression was utterly devoid of emotion. A terrible cold crept over me. I took a slow step inside, my mind scrambling for a logical explanation. Some kind of muscle spasm? A post-mortem reflex? But even as I reached for an answer, another much darker thought took root in the back of my mind, one I didn't want to entertain. I turned to check the monitors, my fingers trembling as I placed them against the screen. No heartbeat, no pulse. Mr. Holloway had been dead for almost an hour. A shudder ran through me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. I knew what I should do, call the nurses, report what I was seeing, but I couldn't move. I forced myself to take another step back, reaching blindly for the call button. And that's when it happened. His head snapped toward me. Not slowly, not like someone waking from sleep, but a jerk, sharp and unnatural, like a marionette being yanked by invisible strings. His mouth opened, and though his chest did not rise, though there was no breath left in his lifeless body, I swear I heard something, a whisper, low, garbled. "You see me." I didn't stay. I didn't check the monitors again. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking so badly I barely managed to pull the door shut. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and even as I stepped into the brightly lit hallway, I could still feel him, his dead, unblinking eyes locked onto me. I don't remember the walk back to my office. I only remember the overwhelming urge to put as much distance as possible between myself and room 407. The next morning, the nurses found him, still sitting up, still staring at the corner of the ceiling. No one could explain it. The doctors chalked it up to some kind of unexplained rigor mortis. The nurses whispered about how his body had been too stiff, how his limbs had locked in place long before they should have, but no one spoke about what I had seen. Since then, I've heard stories from the night staff. They don't linger near room 407. They don't like taking night shifts near that end of the hall. And every now and then, when the hospital is at its quietest, some say they still see something in that bed. A figure, sitting up, eyes fixed on the ceiling, watching something the rest of us aren't meant to see. Hello friends, thank you for watching. A special shout out to our subscribers. You keep these eerie stories alive. But here's the thing, only 30% of viewers are subscribed. If you enjoy our content, hitting subscribe helps us more than you know. It takes a second, but makes a huge difference. While you're at it, like and share to keep the chills coming. Thanks again. You made this possible. See you in the next one, if you dare. Hospitals are not just places of healing. They are places where people come to terms with life's most inevitable truth, the end. I've worked here for years, walking through the hallways, offering prayers, comfort, and a listening ear to those who are dying, those who grieve, and those who are simply trying to make sense of the unknown. There's a rhythm to it. It's not always comforting, but there's a steady quietness in knowing that you're part of something bigger, part of a transition, even if you don't understand it fully. Some things, I believe, are meant to be felt more than understood. It was a cold evening when I was called to pray over an elderly man who was in his final hours. I had been in the hospital all day, offering counsel to family members, sitting with patients, guiding them toward peace. But this time was different. This man had lived a long life, and from the moment I was called to his room, I knew it was his time. I walked down the long corridor of the ward. The lights in the hallway flickered softly, the kind of flicker that comes from old wiring, nothing to make you think of anything supernatural, just the steady hum of the hospital's old systems. I passed by rooms where families sat in silent vigil, holding their loved ones' hands, eyes full of the kind of grief that words couldn't capture. The murmurs of distant conversations, the occasional sound of a door creaking open, the shuffle of feet, it all blended into the background as I walked toward the room where I would offer the final blessing. As I neared the patient's room, something caught my eye. Standing just outside the door, in the dim light of the hallway, was a man. He was dressed in a hospital gown, standing still with his hands folded before him. His face was peaceful, too peaceful for someone who might have been waiting for something. His gaze was directed toward me as I approached. He didn't move, didn't react in any way, but his eyes were intense, almost searching. There was nothing particularly unusual about his appearance, but something about his presence struck me as odd. I've seen many patients and visitors in my time here, some agitated, some anxious, some resigned, but this man's stillness was something else. It wasn't fear or restlessness. It was an odd, silent waiting. I thought perhaps he was a patient who had wandered out of his room, maybe confused, looking for someone to talk to. That happens sometimes. Patients get disoriented or want to escape the solitude of their rooms. I took a few more steps toward him, expecting to offer him a word or two, maybe guide him back to where he belonged. But when I stepped closer, he was gone. It wasn't like he had turned away or had walked off in a hurry. No, it was something more definitive. One moment I was looking directly at him, and in the next instant he was simply not there. There was no sound of footsteps, no rustling of a hospital gown. The hallway, which had just moments ago felt thick with his presence, now felt eerily still. I stood there for a moment, blinking, my mind trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe I was just tired, too focused on my task, or perhaps I had imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. I had seen him. He was there, and now he wasn't. Still unsure of what to make of the encounter, I turned and entered the patient's room. Inside, the nurse was adjusting the blanket on the elderly man, her movements slow, deliberate. His breathing, which had been shallow for hours, had finally stopped. His heart no longer beat. His time had come. The room felt different now. I stood by the bedside for a moment, letting the silence wash over me. I said a quiet prayer for him, for his family, for the peace of his soul. There was no rush, no reason to speak more than was necessary. This man had lived his life, and now it was time for him to rest. Once I finished, I turned to the nurse, offering her a few quiet words of comfort. But as I spoke, I couldn't shake the image of that man in the hallway. He kept lingering in my mind. I wasn't sure why, but I felt compelled to ask her about him. "I saw a man outside just now," I said, almost cautiously, unsure of how she might respond. "He was in a hospital gown. He was standing in the hallway. He seemed, I don't know, waiting. I thought he might be a patient, but when I got closer, he wasn't there." The nurse paused mid-motion, her hand still hovering over the bed. Her face shifted. The color drained from her cheeks, and she turned toward me, her expression one of disbelief, then concern. "What did he look like?" she asked, her voice low, almost urgent. I described him as best as I could. The hospital gown, the way he stood with his hands clasped in front of him, his calm, watchful demeanor. I even mentioned the intensity of his eyes. But before I could finish, her eyes grew wide and her breath caught in her throat. "That's him," she whispered, almost as if speaking to herself. "That's the man who just passed away." The words hung in the air for a long moment. The room, which had been filled with the quiet peace of death, now felt heavier. The nurse looked at me as if she had seen something I had seen too, though I couldn't tell if it was relief, confusion, or some sort of recognition that had come over her face. But for a moment I was speechless. I thought I must have misunderstood, or that my mind had played tricks on me in the dark of the hallway. But as I stood there looking at the lifeless body of the man in the bed, something in me knew that wasn't the case. He had been standing there waiting for me, or waiting for something. But what? What could it mean? I couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper had just passed between us. Had I seen a spirit? Had I witnessed something only those who are about to leave this world could experience? Or was this just a trick of the mind, a fleeting image born out of the exhaustion of my long day? I didn't have the answers. I looked again toward the hallway, half expecting to see him standing there again. But the corridor remained empty. The quiet shadows, the soft glow of the lights, the smell of antiseptic, they were all the same as they had been moments before. The man was gone, but I would never forget him. Not the man in the gown, not the quiet, still figure that had watched me as I passed. His presence, for whatever reason, had stayed with me. Maybe he had been waiting for me to know that his passing wasn't unnoticed. Maybe it was something more. I may never know the full truth, but I carry that moment with me, a reminder that sometimes we don't need to understand everything to feel it deeply. Some things, I believe, aren't meant to be explained, but only felt. Hospitals at night have a certain stillness to them. Some might call it peaceful, but I've always found it unnerving, especially after what happened in the East Wing a few years ago. I've worked as a chaplain long enough to know that hospitals hold memories. Every hallway, every patient room, every waiting area has been touched by sorrow, by love, by final moments whispered between the living and the dying. But sometimes, I wonder if something lingers behind, caught between this world and whatever comes next. It was a quiet shift, one of those nights where time stretches out endlessly. I had just finished praying with a patient in the ICU, a man in his 70s whose family had stepped out for a break. His breathing had been shallow, his grip weak as he thanked me before closing his eyes. I knew he didn't have long. It was the kind of goodbye I had witnessed countless times. Yet it never got easier. I was making my way back to my office when I saw her. She was sitting in one of the visitors' chairs at the very end of the East Wing hallway, perfectly still, hands folded neatly in her lap. At first, I thought nothing of it. A grieving family member, perhaps. Someone who had stepped away from a bedside to collect themselves. But then, I noticed the details. She was wearing an old-fashioned hospital gown, the kind we hadn't used in years. The faded blue fabric hung loosely over her frame, and her hair was long and unkempt, cascading over her shoulders in tangled waves. Her feet were bare, pale against the linoleum floor. She was staring downward, unmoving. Something about her posture unsettled me. There was no subtle shift of breath, no quiet sniffle of someone holding back tears, just absolute stillness. I hesitated, my steps slowing, my instincts prickled with unease. Still, my job was to provide comfort. If she was grieving, she shouldn't be alone. I took a deep breath and stepped toward her. "Ma'am," I said softly, careful not to startle her, "are you all right? Do you need someone to talk to?" She didn't move. Her fingers, resting so delicately in her lap, didn't twitch. She gave no sign that she had heard me at all. Then, the air changed. The hallway, which had been warm moments before, dropped in temperature so suddenly that I felt my breath hitch. It wasn't just a draft or a chill from the AC, it was as if I had walked straight into a freezer. The kind of cold that sinks deep into your bones, making your skin prickle. I exhaled and my breath fogged in the air. Something was very wrong. I should have turned back. I should have walked away. But something about her, the way she sat, the way she seemed to be waiting, compelled me to stay. I took another cautious step forward. "Ma'am?" My voice was barely above a whisper now. I reached out a hand, intending to gently touch her shoulder, and that's when she lifted her head. I froze. Her eyes, God help me, her eyes were black. Not dark brown, not shadowed by the dim hallway lights. Completely, impossibly black. A void where there should have been pupils, irises, anything human. A sharp, instinctual terror surged through me, something primal, something I had never felt before in all my years of sitting beside the dying. Then she smiled. It was slow, deliberate. Her lips stretched just a little too wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too perfect. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me, and then she began to fade. Not like a person walking away, not like a trick of the light. She simply dissolved. Her body broke apart like wisps of smoke, curling into the cold air, vanishing before my eyes. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. My hands were shaking. This wasn't grief. This wasn't exhaustion playing tricks on me. This was something else entirely. I forced myself to turn, to walk, not run, back to the nurse's station. My skin still felt frozen, my breath shaky as I tried to steady myself. I cleared my throat. "Who's in the waiting area down the east wing?" One of the nurses frowned at me. "Nobody," I swallowed. "Are you sure? I just saw..." She cut me off, shaking her head. "That area's been closed off since last week. We're doing renovations. There shouldn't be anyone down there." I stared at her, my blood running even colder than before. I didn't sleep well that night. I still walk past that hallway sometimes, though I never look too closely. I keep my pace steady, my eyes forward. But every now and then, out of the corner of my eye, I swear I see her. Just sitting there, hands folded in her lap, waiting for something. Or someone. Hospice care is a place where life and death exist in a fragile balance. It is where families gather to say their goodbyes, where the final chapter of someone's life is written in the soft whispers of love, grief, and hope. I've spent many nights at the bedside of those nearing the end of their journey, and in that time I've heard many stories, some comforting, some unsettling, but none of them quite like hers. Her name was Lillian. She had been in hospice for several weeks, and as was the nature of things, her condition had steadily worsened. I had met her a few days before she passed away, sitting by her bed, offering comfort, reading her scripture, trying my best to bring peace to a soul teetering on the edge of eternity. There was a quiet strength in her presence. Despite the frailty of her body, her eyes still held a kind of sharp clarity. She had seen much in her life, and her experience had given her an understanding of things that others might not have grasped. The first time she told me about the man, it was late in the evening. Her voice was weak, and I could hear the raspy undertones of the illness that had taken hold of her. But her eyes, still clear, locked onto mine as she spoke. "There's a man," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "a man who comes to see me every night. He has black eyes." I leaned in closer, unsure if I had heard her correctly. In the dim light of the room, her face appeared pale, the lines of her aging skin more pronounced. She had the look of someone who had seen both too much and not enough of the world, someone who was tired but still holding on to the last threads of her reality. "Black eyes?" I repeated softly, almost not believing what I was hearing. She nodded slowly, her expression distant as though remembering something from the past. "Yes," she continued, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "I don't know who he is, but he comes to me every night. He doesn't speak to me in any way I understand. He just whispers in a language that's unfamiliar. I can't make sense of it, but I hear it. It's always the same, and his eyes, they're so black, so dark. It's like there's nothing there." I didn't know how to respond. It wasn't unusual for patients in hospice care to speak of strange dreams, visions, or even visitations. In my years of service, I had heard many such stories, but there was something about the way Lillian said it that struck me. It wasn't fear in her voice, more like acceptance, as if she had become used to the presence of this mysterious visitor. "Have you spoken to anyone about this?" I asked, keeping my tone gentle. She shook her head slowly. "No, I don't think anyone would understand. And I don't want them to think well, I don't want them to think I'm losing my mind. But he's here every night. I know it. And there's something, I don't know, something in the way he looks at me. It's not kind, but it's not threatening either. Just waiting. I didn't know what to say. The thought of a shadowy figure visiting her each night, whispering in an unknown tongue, unsettled me. But I said nothing, simply offering a comforting prayer and reassuring her that she was not alone. But the image of that man, those black eyes, lingered with me long after I left her room. In the days that followed, Lillian's condition continued to decline. She became weaker, her breaths more labored, and each night, without fail, she spoke of the man with the black eyes. Always the same. He came, he whispered, and he waited. Then the night came when she took her last breath. I was not in her room at the moment of her passing. I had been away for just a short time, praying with another patient down the hall. When I arrived back at Lillian's room, I was met by the nurse who had been caring for her. "He's gone," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of the news. "Lillian has passed." There was nothing left to say. I entered the room quietly, my heart heavy, but there was something strange about the atmosphere. The room felt different. There was an almost eerie stillness that seemed to press in on me. The air felt thick, almost as though the very space was holding its breath. I stood by the bedside for a moment, offering a brief prayer for her soul, then turned to leave. But as I reached the doorway, I noticed the nurse standing by the window, looking out into the hallway. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. She was still as a statue. "What is it?" I asked, stepping toward her. The nurse turned slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "I saw something," she said. "Just after she passed, there was a shadow, a figure. It left the room." A chill ran through me. I knew she was speaking with genuine fear, and I could see the trembling in her hands. She continued, her voice faltering. It was him, the man with the black eyes." There was something about the way she said it that made my blood run cold. My mind raced, trying to make sense of her words. Was it a hallucination? Or had Lillian's visitor truly come to take her, escort her into whatever lay beyond? The nurse continued, her eyes still fixed on the door. "I saw him leave her room. It wasn't like a person walking. It was more like a shadow moving against the light. And then it was gone. Just like that." I didn't know how to respond. My first instinct was to try to explain it away, to chalk it up to the stress of the situation, the wariness of the night. But deep down, I knew that wasn't what was happening. There was something here, something I couldn't quite grasp. I stepped out into the hallway, looking in the direction she had indicated. The hallway was empty. There was no shadowy figure in sight, no trace of what the nurse had witnessed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had passed through that hallway, something beyond our understanding. The next few days were a blur. Lillian's passing had affected us all in different ways. The nurse who had witnessed the shadow figure was shaken, her confidence in what she had seen unwavering. And yet, no one else had seen it. No one else had heard the whispers that Lillian had spoken of. It was as if the man with the black eyes had never existed, except in Lillian's words, except in that moment the nurse had witnessed. As for me, I thought often of what Lillian had said about the man, the mysterious visitor with the black eyes who came every night, whispered in an unfamiliar language, and left her waiting for something. Was it a symbol of her transition, a figure who had come to guide her? Or was it something else, something darker, something not to be understood? I still don't know. But I carry her story with me, and I wonder, more than I care to admit, if we truly understand what happens when we cross that final threshold. The line between life and death is thin, but sometimes it feels like there's so much more to see and experience than we'll ever understand. I pray that whatever she encountered in those final moments was a peace she needed, that she was not alone, even when the world could no longer hold her. Perhaps, in the end, all we can do is trust that our loved ones, and those who pass on before us, are not alone in their journey, even if the path remains hidden from our eyes. I've seen my fair share of unusual things in this hospital. Working as a chaplain, you become accustomed to the idea that some patients experience moments that go beyond the physical realm, especially in their final hours. But even so, some stories still manage to rattle me. Stories that I can't quite shake, no matter how hard I try. It was one of those quiet evenings in the hospice wing. The only sound was the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional murmur of the nurses as they went about their rounds. I had just finished praying with a family whose loved one was slipping into the final stages of life. The air felt heavy with the weight of grief, and I was about to take a moment for myself in the chapel before moving on to my next patient. Then the call came. A patient in room 306 had asked for me. It wasn't unusual for people in their final moments to want some spiritual comfort, and I was more than happy to oblige. I walked down the corridor, the soft hum of the overhead lights filling the silence as I approached the room. When I entered, I found Mr. Howard sitting up in bed, his frail hands gripping the sides of the blanket. His eyes, though tired, still held a quiet alertness. The family was there too, gathered around him, watching him with a mixture of love and sorrow. "Father," Mr. Howard said, his voice weak but steady, "I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done for me." I smiled gently, moving to his bedside. "It's my privilege, Mr. Howard. How are you feeling today?" He took a deep breath, his eyes glazing over as if he were remembering something distant. "Last night, there was a nurse," he said slowly. "She was so kind to me. I think she knew how much pain I was in. She just held my hand and talked to me, made me feel less scared. I could sleep for once." I nodded, offering him the quiet support I always did in these moments. "That's very comforting, Mr. Howard. Nurses here are very dedicated. They do all they can to ease our suffering." He smiled softly. "She was different, though. She had a white uniform, the old-fashioned kind, and she had the most gentle voice." He paused, his gaze distant, as if he was looking right through me. "She reminded me of someone I knew long ago." I was about to ask who he meant when the nurse who had been standing by the door, a woman in her 40s with dark hair and a tired expression, stepped forward. Her face had gone an unnatural shade of pale. She was staring at Mr. Howard with wide eyes. "That sounds like Helen," she said in a voice that trembled. "Helen, she used to work here." I raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden change in her demeanor. I'd been here long enough to know that nurses, especially the experienced ones, tended to take things like this in stride. But something in her voice, the way she said it, caught my attention. "Helen?" I asked. The nurse nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. "She was one of the best. She worked here for years, but she passed away 7 years ago. She died in a car accident. It was one of those things that everyone here still remembers." My mind was reeling. I had seen my share of strange occurrences, but this, a nurse, long dead, appearing in the room of a patient, comforting him in his final hours, I couldn't make sense of it. I turned back to Mr. Howard, who looked at me with a calm certainty, as if he knew exactly what had just transpired. "I don't know why, Father," he said softly, "but she was there. I know it was her. She looked just like the woman in the picture I used to have. The same soft smile, the same quiet way about her." I glanced at the nurse, whose face was now ashen. She looked like she had seen a ghost. "Helen?" I said quietly. "Are you sure?" The nurse nodded again, her voice breaking slightly. "It's impossible. She died so many years ago. There's no way she could have been here." I didn't know what to say. I had heard stories before, about people seeing loved ones who had passed or sensing a presence that gave them comfort in their final moments. But this, a nurse from years ago, appearing to comfort a dying man in a hospital where she had worked, and then vanishing without a trace. It didn't fit with anything I knew. I wanted to offer some sort of logical explanation, some way to ease the tension in the room, but I couldn't. I looked down at Mr. Howard, whose peaceful expression made me wonder if he even fully understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. "He was so peaceful after she left," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't afraid anymore. She made me feel safe." The nurse who had spoken earlier stood there, still frozen, her hands clasped tightly together. I saw tears gathering in her eyes. "Helen was the kindest soul I've ever known," she whispered. "She would have done something like that. She was always there for the patients. Always." As I stood there, a quiet realization settled over me. Perhaps we're not always meant to understand everything. We may never truly know why certain things happen the way they do, or why some people, long gone, might still find a way to offer comfort to the living. It's a mystery that, for all my years of experience, I can't explain. But sometimes, perhaps we're not meant to. Maybe what matters most is the comfort it brings, the fact that someone was there when they were needed, even if they shouldn't have been.